save Israel from Egypt and into life with him. Moses' life was spared, and he actually went from supposed to die to the good life, right? Again, he was supposed to die. That was his destination with the decree. But instead, to the good life. As a Hebrew boy, as an Israelite, he was raised in Egypt and he had wealth. He ended up becoming educated, a prince, a judge, someone of status. He had a voice. And little did young Moses know that God would use him later to deliver the Israelites. I keep making the point that this is before his calling. Up until now, it seems like a great success story. But sometimes we ask ourselves, so why didn't God just use Moses at that time to deliver the Israelites? Have you thought about that? He was set up to be the person. That's what we think, right? And we have to learn that God's thinking is always higher than our thinking. That's why it's his story. My second point, which is actually probably the longest one, is you're waiting, God is working. Turn to your neighbor and say, God is working. You're waiting, but God is working. We're going to read verses 11 to 22. It's kind of lengthy, but stick with me. So we just read, Moses and how he was rescued. Now let's look at what happens in the story next. Verse 11. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Look at this one. Verse 12, after looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Uh-oh. Verse 13, the next day when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one that started the fight. Verse 14 says, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday? I'm going to take a pause. That's his own people saying that to him now. Verse 15. Oh, sorry. We'll continue the second half of verse 14. Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. 15. And sure enough, Moses heard what had happened. Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs with their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherd. Then he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, why are you back so soon today? Verse 19 says, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherd, they answered. And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Then where is he? The father asked. Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. 21 says, Moses accepted the invitation, and then he settled there to be with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. And last verse, later she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. You can see how it went a little downhill for Moses. Have you ever had the experience where everything is coming together and then it doesn't? Right? Everything just looks right. It's going your way, but then it falls apart. The conditions are perfect, but then the storm hits. On paper, you have the championship NBA team, but you can't win a game. That was Moses' life, the first 22 verses of Exodus 2. Moses goes from being the potential deliverer to being an exiled shepherd in Midian. Supposed to be Pharaoh, but instead a shepherd. And Moses was perfectly positioned to be the deliverer of Israelites at that time. He was educated. Like I said, he was mighty in status. He was great in words and deeds. Who better to negotiate freedom for the Israelites? Moses thought he was training to be the next Pharaoh of Egypt, but God was preparing Moses for something else. Let's look back at the story. So Moses witnesses an Egyptian beating a fellow Hebrew, and Moses ends up killing that Egyptian. But here's a glimpse of Moses' desire to identify with God and his people. He sees the oppression, the need for rescuing, and here again is the theme of saving or salvation, someone needing to be saved. Then Moses then witnesses two Israelites fighting and tries to encourage them to stop, and the two Israelites, his own people, actually reject him, and they question him and say, "Who sent you to be our judge or our prince?" And this is actually foreshadowing of the stubborn and ungrateful hearts of the Israelites that Moses will have to work with later. But they even shared the knowledge that they know that Moses killed a man. I would say this records one of the lowest points of the life of Moses. And, he was a murderer. His own people were rejecting him. And Pharaoh eventually found out about Moses. And what he did was put Moses on the most wanted list, right? So, fearing for his life, rejected by his own people, Moses ran to the land of Midian. Now, I did some research. Moses ran to Midian, all the way there. Midian's about 360 miles away. Disneyland is like 400 miles. Could you imagine running to almost Disneyland from here? Running for your life. That's a lot of running, right? Not only is Moses running from his place of living, but Moses is running away from his status, his position that he had. Now, if you look at Exodus 2 in a human perspective, it's a story of failure. Would you say that? Moses had all this potential, yet it went downhill. Do we ever look at our life as a story of failure? It's easy to look at these verses and say, where's God? Did God take a break for 12 verses? Is that what we think sometimes? When things don't go our way, or when we feel failure in our life, or we're going through that season? When Moses was fleeing for his life, he probably felt that God's plan for his life was completely defeated. He probably thought there was nothing he could do. But little did Moses know that he was right where God wanted him. God turned bad into good, using this as an opportunity for Moses. An opportunity for God to disciple him, to refine Moses' faith, to instill a heart of compassion, a desire to save. When he gets to Midian, Moses then comes across the 7 daughters of a priest in Midian that were being harassed by some shepherds, right? And Moses once more saw the oppression. He saw the suffering. And Moses got up and came to their rescue. Here again is the theme of rescuing, of redemption, of saving in Moses' life. Moses had this growing determination to save, and this is the type of person God was raising up as a deliverer. Story goes, and it says Moses settled in Midian, got married, and became a shepherd, but this time period that we're talking about is 40 years of waiting. Seems like a long time. 40 years of waiting. And Moses was likely undergoing a period of preparation and transformation that God was doing in his heart. A time of waiting and learning. God knew that Moses needed these maybe quiet years to prepare him to be an effective leader. Waiting, he renews your strength in your waiting period, as we sang earlier this morning. And it was as a shepherd when God would reach out to Moses and Moses would receive his special calling and mission. God's big plan to redeem the Israelites. Now, when we talk about our life or we think about our life, we make the mistake when we think that the waiting time is, just us on a shelf waiting to be used, or God will come back to us. It's a mistake to think that the years in Midian were just a waiting time for Moses. Your waiting time is God's working time. They were working years for Moses. And as in, God is always working. In that waiting period, God trained him and shaped him for his future calling. Again, I'm trying to make a point that this is all prior to the call of Moses to free the people. God is speaking to you, working within you, shaping you, even prior to your calling. If you think that you're waiting, God is working. God is working before, during, and after. Moses transitioning from prince to shepherd, that could look like a demotion, right? That could look like a setback, but it prepared him for the colossal task ahead that God had for him. Moses left Egypt at age 40, then spent 40 years in waiting in Midian before God called him back to Egypt. And we often, again, look at waiting as a bad time, right? This waiting period, I tell you right now, it was not the most exciting part of Moses' story. It's not the burning bush. It's not about the 10 plagues. It's not the parting sea. I thought about it. I said, Pastor John gave me the boring part of Moses. But it's not that. God is still working. It doesn't mean God was not at work during this time, because we know he's always working, and God continues to work in our lives every single day, even in our waiting season, refining us, preparing us for his purpose, guiding us even when we don't realize it, when we can't recognize the plan. It doesn't matter. It's not your plan. It's his plan. God is working. He's not looking at you and says, hey, Kazan, I'm going to leave you on a shelf. I'll work on you later. Or Aaron, I'm just going to leave you, set aside you here until I need you. He's always working. We need to recognize that. We see it in every phase of Moses' life, that it was a stepping stone to where God wanted him to be. And same thing with your life. Don't look at your waiting or your failures as a setback. It's a stepping stone to where God wants you to be. My last point is he saves. And we go back again to the theme. God is always faithful to take care of his people. This is not just an overall theme of Exodus chapter 2. This is not just a theme of the book of Exodus. But this is a theme throughout the entire Bible. God has a plan of redemption, saving, rescuing for us. In one of Moses' final speeches, he says a prophecy, and we're going to jump a little to Deuteronomy 18:15. Just one verse. And it says, Moses continued, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. Let's look at the facts. He will be raised up by God. He will come from the Israelites. He will be like Moses. The prophet who fulfills these words of Moses is Jesus Christ. And hopefully you recognize that Moses and Jesus were similar. They were both miraculously preserved in childhood. Both were hidden as babies to avoid being killed by kings who were murdering babies to control the population. Both were born during times of oppression. Both were rejected with spite. They were rejected in their right to be prince and judge over their people. They were rejected and would not be listened to. They both performed miracles. They were both redeemers, prophets, kings, shepherds. They both fasted for 40 days at the beginning of their ministry. They both sent out 12 men for a purpose. They both established Passover elements. The prophecy in Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses told the Israelites that God would raise up a prophet like this, and Jesus Christ fulfilled that prophecy and promise. The Bible is not just a book of many different stories, but it's a book of how many stories, I'm sorry, I said that wrong, but it's a book of many stories that ultimately tell one single story. It's not a conspiracy theory like how all the Pixar movies take place in, some galaxies and whatever. I think this is what it is. This is history. It really happened, but it's his story for us. His story of redemption, salvation, rescuing his people. Exodus is the history of a nation of Israel upheld by the promise of God. And remember, Israel is us. Exodus is the story of God's rescue. And even though this is Moses' life, it's Moses' story, Moses is not the protagonist. From start to finish, the main character is not Moses, the main character is not the Israelites, the main character is not you or me. From beginning to end, everywhere in between, the main character is God. Again, even at your waiting, even in your lowest point, every single second of your life, God is working. He has a plan. And Exodus is also just foreshadowing God's plan to rescue, redeem, and save us for his glory. Here's another parallel. Moses could not deliver his people from where he lived in the palaces of glory. He had to come down off of his throne, away from his palace, and into a humble place before he could deliver his people. Moses' story is a reminder of the gospel, of how Jesus came down from his throne, stepped down from heaven to earth, took a humble position so that he can deliver his people from eternal death. Our God is so detailed and intentional. Wow. If I can call up the worship team. If I can invite everyone to also stand. God, we see, even in the life of Moses, the intricate details, your well thought out plan, your intentional plan for him started even before he was aware of it. You were saving him even as a young boy. And you were repeating the theme of redemption and salvation and rescuing throughout every part of his life. God, truly, you're also speaking to us. Help us to recognize in the seasons that we're in, the circumstances that we're in, that you always have a plan to redeem, rescue, save, restore, heal us. And God, as we specifically looked at Moses' waiting season, some of us may be in that season right now. Help us to recognize this is not a season where you take a break, or we take a break, or it's on pause. But God, this is just an opportunity for you to work in our lives, work in our heart, to mold us, to transform us, to speak to us, to give us rest, to ignite a passion, to impart your wisdom, whatever you choose to do. God, we look at this as you preparing us for the work that you have in store for us. God, God, we look at even every aspect of our life, even the past, the present, and the future. We know that you are there. You've been there. The same God that was with Moses is the same God now with us, with each and every one of us in this room. God, we again thank you for your word, and I just pray that this word that came from you penetrates our hearts. And we shift our focus on you. Let our worship and praise and the words we speak be thanksgiving and gratefulness and adoration for what you have done for us. That's why we can continue to worship you amidst our storms and our struggles and our trials. Because we know that you never leave us, that you are with us. And that one day you will lift us up. You will draw us out. God, we thank you so much. And as we sing this song, when I think about the Lord, I encourage you to again think of what He's done. The good and the bad, the ups and the downs, the past, the present, the future. Everything is part of His plan, preparing us for the work that He has in store for us.